Okie doke.
Yep.
All right, we will. Yeah. All right, we will get started for the evening on the obligatory lecture portion. I believe I'm now correctly showing my screen and sound should be coming through on the YouTube video. All right. Is the microphone loud enough, hearable? In the back, is it hearable? I can't really tell if it is. All right. So based on what I heard going around sort of in those questions, it seemed like there were two, you can correct me if I am wrong, or just post the questions in Slack or ask them. Seemed like the two areas of largest need of clarification are around Git and branching and sort of just Git in general, as well as cascading, style sheets, in so much as what cascading means and the impact that has on your projects. Seemed like everyone had a good handle on the HTML, so I'll cover that portion. Same as the others, but I'll cover it a little quicker, and then focus a bit more on the CSS and the Git tonight. Feel free, if you do have a question with the HTML, to send it to me directly or in the Slack channel, or you can just shout. If I don't cover it fast enough, or if I'm covering it too fast, don't cover enough, feel free to ask. All right, so we will start with the HTML. My sort of walkthrough tonight to recover the material is very much similar to the assignment you have due next Thursday. It doesn't quite, on purpose, meet all the requirements of that assignment. But from a project layout standpoint and the files and some of the stuff it does, sort of can give a good at-a-glance idea of how to move forward with that assignment. So as I had mentioned, I'm missing a terminal. There it is. As I mentioned on Monday, something that I like to do so that I can see the file. Oh, that's why. That's not actually. Funny thing, the default Python on the Mac is an older version of Python. That's why it didn't work. So when you run the Python 3 command, that -m http.server, that's how you get to have the website run. So that's what I do, so I can see it locally easily and see it in the browser the same way that the browser would read it if it were being sent from a web server. So there could be some differences in the browser. You'll notice this as you work with it more and more. When you open a file in the browser and you open it and it has in the URL line file : / and then your path to your file, you might get a different result than if you go and get it from a locally running web server or an external web server. And that's due to, as I mentioned on Monday, different things with security for how browsers interpret the file being served from web server versus locally. It's for your protection as a user, but if you do start to see something weird, I recommend making sure that what you're looking at in the web browser is from something locally serving it, so you can rule out something like that as the problem. It's actually a recommendation in general when trying to figure out why something in your HTML or your CSS isn't working as desired, is to eliminate as many possible points as you can. Because as you get deeper into the CSS and the HTML, there are many reasons something won't look like you want it to. All right. Without further on that, we'll go straight into information on what we're covering. Some of what I will mention, we'll recover what we did Monday due to sort of how HTML and CSS work. Kind of have to work off the base that we started on Monday every day. So you'll get a little bit of review every class. So at the top, doc type tells the browser what type of document it's rendering. That allows it to have performance benefits when it reads your file. Then you start with your HTML tag. That's the first element in all HTML files. And you put everything inside there. You have your head, which is at the top, which is the very first element. Inside of there is where you put the meta information and external resources usually for your web page. So in this case, I've used this tag called meta that is not in your, as I mentioned on Monday. I will include extra things that as a web developer, it is bothersome to me when they're not there. Just tells the browser how to read it. Similar to that doc type HTML, it's a further clarification to the browser with that meta char set equals UTF-8. So the browser can know how to read the file. The link, as was covered in the reading material, that is how you pull in external files into your HTML file so that when the browser reads it, it knows that when you use a class, like I did down there, class equals image, it tells it, oh, I can look over in this file because you've linked another file. So inside the head, when you use that link tag, which is a self-closing tag, it's one of the few that does not require a closing, matching closing tag. So like title, it opens, you put something in the title, and then you close it with what's called a closing title tag. Link is one of the ones that does not require a closing tag. You can just put the slash and close it off. A link specifically has 3 attributes that you will generally fill out as you start to add external files. The rel is short for relationship. It tells it the relationship that file will have with the rest of the document. So the HTML file is called a document. That's why you put doc type at the top. That rel tells the browser what the relationship is to the content in there. So this file's relationship, the CSS/base.css, is that it's a style sheet. So then the browser knows, all right, everything in here, I can treat it as a style sheet. The type tells it what type of file it is. So in this case, it's a text CSS file. The type of file that this HTML file is a text HTML. Those file types are used by the browser to further know how to read it. Because you could have a style sheet that isn't necessarily a text CSS style sheet. It will still use CSS within it, but you could use a different file type. The other part that will matter here is, as we had JavaScript, that type will also be different if you're linking out externally to get another file. So if you declare the type, browser knows how to interpret that file. The href, similar to the anchor tag that we covered on Monday, anywhere that you use a href as an attribute in HTML, tells the browser there is a hyperlink here out to something external to this current page. So in this case, it's saying there's an external file called css/base.css. And that file, so that you can see it, is pointing to right here, base.css. Won't cover the CSS yet, so I want to go over the HTML first. But just so that's clear, that href tells it, okay, look at the current directory, which is where index is. Go to a path of CSS/base.css. So right here, I have a CSS folder, which matches, and then I have a base.css file. So that is how link works, and that's how the browser inside of head knows where to go and retrieve the styles for this page. Title is what shows in the little tab at the top. Covered that on Monday, I believe. So it shows at the very top. So Facebook, it often will do nice things, like if you get a message through Messenger and you're on Facebook, it'll sort of like make a little ding. Or in Slack, it turns it red whenever someone sends you a message, so that you can see it and know that you have a new message. My title's pretty boring. It's just plain text. It doesn't do anything very exciting. So the first new tag of the evening is the H1. As this sort of help text says, the H1 element represents a section heading. What that means for the browser and often your users is that the H followed by the number tells it kind of how important that heading is. So an H1 is often used to say, this is sort of the most important heading on the page. And sort of H2s in a given area, those are of equal importance, all the way down to the H6, which would be the least important, but still a heading, so it should be pulled out. And in general, when it comes to HTML, this is actually all based on the markup that was originally used for newspaper printers. So newspapers, all the way back to the 50s and 60s, I believe, used this style of tags around text so that the printer knew how to print out the newspaper. So that's where a lot of the history behind how these tags look and where they're at comes from, is that laying out content originally was just on newspapers, which newspapers often have headings. You can actually think of it as sort of the same thing. First thing you see on a newspaper is the biggest heading. That's where the H1 would be. Then you see some sub-articles on there, and then the headings get a little smaller. That's where your H2, H3 through H6 would end up getting used. So anytime you see a web page and you're thinking about laying out different information, you can sort of think about it, if it were a newspaper page, how would that look? And that's how you can think about what tags to use a lot of the times. All H's are headings. The image tag, which is a pretty awesome tag, allows you to pull in an external file and then have it show on the page. As you've probably seen, you look at a news article, you have an image in there, makes it a lot easier. Add extra content. Most articles will always have an image, both because it's more pleasing and because search engines will rank your pages higher if they contain images than if they do not. As a bonus, I'll give you search engine optimization techniques as we go throughout the class. So the same sort of link here. Images get a source. And the source attribute, which is used on a few other types of elements, is different than the href, because source is sort of saying this is what makes this tag actually have something about it. Whereas an anchor tag, you put something inside, it can be an anchor. The href can sort of is what the interaction will be. So if you put an anchor around about in your navigation, you click the about, that takes you to the about page, but you still have about text. So instead of just talking about it abstractly there, so say you had an about page. That is what you would write as an anchor tag, and it uses href. The href there is saying, when you interact with this element, you're going to go to this other reference, this hypertext reference, which is about.html, which is another page. For an image, you have source, which is to say this is what makes up this element. So an image is always made up of a picture of some kind. And that is what makes it possible. So images are also self-closing tags. And I've used another attribute in here that was not covered, but it is something you should do on almost every image. 99.9% of the time that you have an image on your website, you should include what's called alt text. That has two benefits. Number one, someone who is visually impaired can have the alt text read to them so they can understand what's in the image, so they can know what's there. If you look at XKCD, an online comic, they use the alt text often to add extra humor to the image. Is that coming from my computer? Or somewhere else? So alt text, first case, it helps someone who has a visual impairment. The second reason for it is, say you're linking from a news article to an external image that you don't own, but you're linking to, say, someone's Flickr account or a Snapchat that didn't get deleted that's stored off somewhere, or a Facebook image. The advantage of that alt text is, say that person deletes the image, it will no longer have that picture behind it because it will be missing. So then what happens is that alt text gets displayed in place of where your image was. So that can make it easier for your web page if the image is missing, or if the person looking at your website has some kind of virus protection or ad blocker in place that doesn't allow images to show. You can still convey the meaning behind your images on your web pages. That's what the alt tag does. Class can be used on all of the display elements in HTML, and that, with CSS, is what allows them to be styled. You should almost always be using classes to style your HTML. If you're going to apply styles, to all the reasons yet, because you haven't had enough opportunity to work with CSS for that strong of an opinion to be given, but it is very important to try to mostly only use classes to style your HTML. If you learn nothing else from tonight, only use classes to style your HTML. As tedious as it may be to put a class on every element, you'll be happy with yourself later as I cover selector specificity, and that is why you want to use classes. So another example here of inline elements. The reason that I keep bringing up block level elements and inline elements, and will continue to do so for the next week or two, is as you add CSS, and if you notice, whenever you made the circles, in today's pre-class, we made the 3 circles that were sorting your friends, well, really people, into enemy, friends, and another group I can't remember. It used a display : inline block, which combines how an inline element displays and a block level element displays. So as we work further along, that's why I keep mentioning inline elements and block elements and keep having those questions at the start of each class. With CSS and the HTML, it is very important to understand the flow, what's called the document flow in your HTML, because as you start to get display issues, a lot of it will boil down to whether or not the element is an inline or a block level element, both in type, be it like a div tag or a p tag, which is by default a block level element, or if someone's written some CSS to override that, where it becomes an inline element or block element or an inline block. That's why that question keeps coming up. By default, span tag is inline. That means that text will flow, it It will continue to flow in a straight line with whatever's displaying with it. P tag is a block level element. That means it will break wherever it is in the flow of text on the screen or whatever's being displayed there. If this is difficult to see, let me know. There's also that monitor's plugged in the back to make it a little easier to see. If you're in the last few table sections, projects right here is using an H2 because on the about page, it's not as important as the sort of content title of being about inside that H1. First question of tonight, I believe, will involve the differences between ULs and OLs, also known as unordered lists and ordered lists. Every list, be it unordered or ordered, has list elements inside it. So each one of those list elements goes and allows you to make a list. It is very common when writing websites to use lists all over the place because it's very likely that what you're doing is listing some kind of content out, whether it be a list of articles on a page, of items for a recipe, order of operations that you would do for that recipe. There are a lot of reasons to use lists. They're quite common on the internet. Now what you can do within list items is you can put almost any element you want inside of a list. So you can go, so what I've done in this list is I've gone and put links to various projects that I've worked on. And I've added in these links another example of an attribute that you can look up. I mentioned it previously in the previous class, and it will mention in the studio, as well as the assignment for next Thursday. Looking at various attributes you can add to elements. The target attribute for the anchor element is what controls, usually, how the browser will behave when you click a link. So when you go to a website and you click a link and it always just opens a new window or it opens in a new tab or changes your current page that you're on, each one of those is for a different value given to target. In this case, under blank should open it in a new tab. If you don't put anything there, by default, it will change just the window that you're on. So if you're on Google.com and you click a link, it usually just changes right there. And there's another option you can use that I can't remember. I'd have to Google it. That is another under attribute that can force it to open in a new window. I think it's under new, but I'm not positive, so I'd have to look it up. The reason I say usually, and this is often the case when you do web development, is browser settings can override anything you put in there. So if a user states never open a new tab, always refresh it right here, there's nothing you can do to change that because of the user setting they have on their browser. So a lot of what you do when you write web pages is give a strong suggestion as to what should happen when it renders on the page, but that may not be what happens. So when you're debugging problems, make sure first you're sure that what you have isn't causing the problem, and then usually follow up with a question asking if they have any sort of setting in their browser. A very common problem to see, and this might actually be some of the problem people have had using Codecademy, where it looks like some elements aren't getting styled properly, or they're just not getting styled at all. And if certain plugins you have for your browser, be it Internet Explorer, Firefox, Chrome, can interact with the way every web page is rendered that you're viewing. So always make sure that when you're testing out new HTML that you've written, that you've shut off all of your browser plugins so that you can rule out that a browser plugin is what's causing something to not display properly. This list, this is an unordered list. I put a bunch of links to projects in here. Gave them all a class of project link, so they would be styled similarly. And sort of the format I gave them was using this colon, and then another inline attribute that you can look up called small. It's similar in usage to the B tag or the I tag for bold or italic. Small, as it says there, it's a small element, represents side comments such as a small print. So in this case, I'm using it to sort of give a small, brief description of the project so that you can see it in the list. As a side note, there's actually a different tag I would use if we had covered it to do what I'm doing here. It's also another type of list. But I'm not doing it yet specifically because of that. We have not covered it yet. And then finally, the last one I have here, it's another anchor tag. I have a class on here called contact link, which is a link to contact. Much like you see on many websites, there's a contact us button or a page you can go to that has a form. A lot of them will just have a button that you click and then it magically opens up your Outlook or your Gmail and already has things filled out for you to send them an email. The way that you do that is by using the href attribute on the anchor tag. In this particular case, in order to have it pre-populate with a 2 in an email, is you do mail to, colon, and then the email that you want it to, by default, send to. So in this case, I would only want it by default to email me because it's a page about me. So the contact would be for me. And then this is really my personal preference when it comes to buttons that contact is to open in a new tab, because oftentimes if someone is using some kind of plugin in their browser or is using something like Google Inbox or Gmail, it will end up just replacing their current screen with a way to send an email, and then they can't get back to the website they were on. So then it can kind of divert users away from your website by accident while they're trying to contact you, which can be frustrating for the user. So when it comes to emailing with people clicking a button, I usually recommend having it open in a new tab. So to sort of see what this page looks like, I'll zoom in. It's a wee bit too far, but that should be all right. At the top is that H1, which I've actually not really given any styles to. Every browser by default, as you'll see in the studio, has a lot of default styles that it will give for every single element, which also adds even more frustration whenever you're writing style sheets and trying to figure out why something looks different in multiple browsers. And that's because there are defaults in every browser for what an element should look like. So the H1 is at the top. If you notice here, I have this lead-in text that is a slightly different size in 2 spots. It's very common whenever you write content on a website, news site, blog, anything that really has content to try to draw people's eye. You'll have the starter text be a little bit bigger. Same thing happens in books usually. First few words or the first letter in the paragraph of a new chapter will be extra big or have some fancy character there, sort of draw your eye and get you to read. So what I did in the HTML over here, to achieve that, is I used that span, and then I created a class called text lead-in. Do not worry about my hyphens and whatnot. I'll talk about that in a few weeks. You can actually sort of use mostly whatever you want as an identifier. So similar in Python, we have the identifiers for variables. Variables were called identifiers. The identifier used here for this class, you can have hyphens, you can have underscores, you can use some other what might be peculiar symbols if you wanted to. The key is there can't be a space. As soon as there's a space, it thinks there's two classes. So that lead-in, that text lead-in class, and the reason that I sort of name it like that is so that you know it applies to text, and that the way it's used is lead-in. So sort of the lead-in for an article. And then a picture of myself and my wife to the side so that you know whose website it is. An about page should always have a picture. And then at the bottom, I had mentioned that there was a project. So over here in the HTML, to give a look, we have that tag, and then each one of these list elements. And a lot of the times, whenever I write HTML, this may not be the case with a project that you do yourself or that other people are working on or that you come across. I like to put, if I'm going to have more than one or two attributes, I generally put them each on their own line in the HTML so that it's easier to read and know what's there. Put them all in one line, it makes it kind of hard to see all the attributes you've defined. So it's just sort of a coding practice that I follow to make it easier to know what's happening there. So here, this had the under blank. So what that does is it opens it in a new tab. All I did was click the link, opened in a new tab, and then this is just a GitHub repo. I will actually come back to this repo in a few minutes to cover Git. Then the last bit here is the button. And if you notice, as you hover over the button, it has this nice little interaction where it gets a dotted border. And you can, I'm going to zoom in more. And notice that the color is gray and it slowly fades to black. All things you can do with CSS. Button change. So that's all with the base CSS file. So I'll start at the top of this file and then work my way down. So the HTML, when you use that, this is where the cascading takes effect. HTML is the outermost element. So I'll open these two code windows so you can see them. The HTML selector there is an element selector. And then it will apply to the HTML tag there. And anything inside the HTML tag, which is underneath it, will have a cascading style that says the font size will be 16 pixels, the line height, which is one that we've not covered, but that specifically states that it will be size. So your font has a certain size, but then there's a line that it rests on. You can think of it like lines on a piece of paper. The font will be 16 pixels. The line height will be 1.2 times larger than that. So that will give anywhere that there's text on the page a little bit extra space, so it can be easier to read. Background color, I made it a little of an off gray instead of being a stark white. There's some nice research that's been done that if you do strict black and white, it is legible, but if you can make it a little bit less of a stark contrast, it's easier on someone's eyes reading it so they can read for longer. Sort of why things like the Kindle and the iPad, whenever you're reading, have night mode options, and they usually have some slightly manila color in the background and then slightly off black text. And the font family I use is Helvetica, just sort of have a font family on there. Give an example. Now you'll notice what I do immediately is on body, I give font size, and then I override it immediately on body to 1 rem. So it is mentioned, the EM. Rem is another measurement, much like EM. I prefer it over EM because the difference is what they do. So, which is sort of obvious. And there's a bunch of different options you can use, primarily. So pixels, 16 pixels is the default. 1EM, what that does is tell it to be 1 times the size of the parent element. So in this case, HTML is the parent element of body, so it will be 1 times that size, which means it will be 16 pixels, because that's what 1EM will do. What 1rem says to do is to be 1 times the size of the base font size for the root element. The root element in HTML for your document will always be HTML. So that's what the R stands for. It's the root EM. So for example, where I have margin top and margin bottom, if I were to make this 1 EM, that makes it 1 times the font size of the containing element, which what that can cause to have happen visually on the screen is if you have a bunch of, say, nested articles, or you have articles that have some subtext inside of them, it can cause them to get really small or really large, depending on the direction, whenever you nest elements, because it always goes 1 times the parent. So that can lead to some very weird visual effects on a page. So my recommendation, if you're using what's called a relative sizing, which is what EMs and REMs do, is to almost always use REMs. The relative sizing is nice because it will give you an easy change to your site overall. So the REMs are based on the font size. The base font size is 16 pixels, so the cascading effect, anywhere that I use that REM will base itself on that font size. So I say that the H1 should be 3 times that base font size, which means it should come out to be 30 plus 54. No, 58. 48. I can do the maths eventually. Comes out to be 48. After the studio, I'll show that that is the case. There's a question in the back. Yes.
I didn't quite get the difference between so rem is multiplied by the font size that you define in HTML. Then what's M relative to?
The containing element. So I'll give an example here. I'll put it just above the title. So if I give a class here called example, and I'll give some text, and the don't ever actually do this where you do inline styles. That's not great. So if I make this example class and I do a font size is 1.2, and then in here, I go and say font size is 2EM. Now when I come over to this page, I refresh, I'm going to spoil your studio. And spoil it for something I can't read that. So if I, for instance, say this is 8 pixels, and then I do that 2EM, and I refresh this page, Oh, wait. Ruining it because I have a lot of other styles overriding it. I'll remove that. Sorry, I'm messing it up because of selector specificity, because of that style there. Yes. There we go. It also helps when I refresh. I do a full so. As an example, the actual problem there. I was just refreshing with Command R. I did not do what is called a hard refresh. Command Shift R in most browsers. So browsers, because they're awesome, will cache what's called cache content for you. What that means is they will store pages, and instead of going through the internet to go and grab that information, they'll just reuse what they already have cached. Locally, in this case, the CSS file I have, because I was just doing a regular refresh, it was using that same one over and over and over. So back to the task at hand to show what the EMs do. So I have that some text here, and I've said this should be 8 pixels. I go here and say the font size should be 1 EM. Doesn't change because it's relative to its containing element. Now when I say it should be 1 rem, it changes because the root element has a font size of 16 pixels. So that is the difference between the two. REM goes to the root element to get its styles that it's going to be based on, and EM goes to the direct parent element to get its styles. Then you also got to see examples of selector specificity causing styling issues. So the other ways that I've added styles here, something you can do whenever you apply styles. You want to add the same style to multiple elements, really multiple selectors. You do selector, comma, selector, comma, selector. Keep doing that for all the selectors you want to apply your style to. Your styles inside of there, and it will apply to all of the selectors you've listed in that list. Yes, Reggie.
Change the HTML.
This one? All right, to show sort of what that does. I deleted that. I didn't save it though. Also, something else to be aware of, make sure you always save your files. So if I change this to 8 pixels, immediately all the values change on the site for spacing and where everything is at.
You make it like the default.
Yeah, so default zoom, this is what it looks like whenever I change the base font size to 18 pixels to 8 pixels. If I put it at 16, pixels here, update it, everything automatically got larger because of using the REM, what is that called? It's like feet measurement. The REM unit of measure. That's what it's called. So for the similar styles I want to share here across the different types of headers. So for all the headers, I want them to have a margin top and margin bottom. That is the size of a line of text. So I give them 1 rem. For all 6 of my headers, I sort of want to scale them to be H1 to be the largest, and then from there sort of get smaller and smaller. I started to hear a question, I think.
I was confused about the order, sorry.
So then the H1, I make that 3 times, and then for each one of these,
Why did you go to, why is H2, 2, and H3, 2.25?
because I did that poorly. That was supposed to be, that is a good catch. Your sizes should reflect what they are. The real reason that I did it was because I started that off at a 4 REM on the H1 and it was way too big. And then I just went through and changed them the other day and failed to update the H3 properly. So when you do those relative sizings, make sure as you do H1, H2, all the way through your H6, that they get smaller so that visually an H1 is larger, X is the smallest. So that's how I style those. For P tags, which are paragraph tags, I give them a slight off black color, so it can be a little easier on the eyes. And then same as the H tags, I give them a margin top and bottom of 1 rem. Now the reason in the CSS that I did not include the P tag with all these H tags up here, even though it's the same styles, is because oftentimes as you're developing a website and you make changes, you'll want to go, oh, I need all the headings to go and do something. But if you're mixing different types of elements together in your CSS, it makes it a lot harder to say, oh, I just want all the headings now to have a 1.5 margin at the top. Because then at that point, you would have accidentally added it to paragraphs, and then all the content in your site, because the cascading style sheets would start to look off compared to what a new design you got sort of wanted it to look like. So that's why when you're sharing styles, even though it may be the same 1 or 2 lines of styles, it is easier to maintain if you copy it to only be with elements of similar usage.
Might be a little bit off topic, but how are you choosing those color values? It's kind of a big string, text string, and it's like, how did you?
Oh yeah, so the question was, how did I choose those color values? Because they're sort of random hex values. So normally what I will do is I actually, there's a nice site, sort of choose those values. What I did for this, because I failed to, there's a government research that gives recommendations on what those values should be. What I actually did to set those values for this class was I selected one of these, and then in Chrome, we'll cover this in the studio, I clicked here, and then you can use this nice little color wheel, slide it around, and it'll spit out the value for you below. But we'll cover that during the studio so that it's easier to cover. But that's how I got how I kind of chose these kind of random values. All of my anchor tags, I wanted them to be a certain color, so I chose, this was me honestly just typing in different values because this was covered in the Python when we did turtles, and we talked about text colors. The first two represent the amount of red. The next one is the amount of green, and the last one is the amount of blue in the color. They're hexadecimal, which means they are numbers in base 8 instead of base 10. So we'll go 1 through 9, and then base 16. Good call. I was corrected. I heard someone. It is base 16. Otherwise, that would be. If you're wrong, you would go past 8. It's base 16. So what happens is you go 0 to 9, 0 being the lowest, 9 being slightly above halfway, and then A through F is the next set. And that's where I sort of chose this value is I knew I wanted it to be completely blue. So I did FF, which is give me 100% blue. And then the AF says to sort of give me kind of like a halfway red, halfway green, a little more green than usual, because that A is, so 0 is the least, 9 is kind of just above the middle. A is more, the first value will be higher up in intensity. Then that 6 says I sort of want way less red than green. So that's how I chose the blue value. I just kind of played with it until I got sort of a baby blue color that I liked. And that's why the link colors look like this. Small, I'm specifically styling the small tag because I want side text to be smaller relative to all the other text. So I did .75 rem, which tells it to be about 3/4 the size of the base text of the page. So this is where another example of where the cascading comes in, because the base size is 16, that cascades down, and then this font size being a relative font size says, all right, I'll take that cascaded root node value of 16 and I'll become 3/4 that size at 12. Then the image, how I got it to display there, I gave it a width and a height. I actually just sort of played with the width and height values until the image wasn't too stretched. That's not the best way to do it. There are other ways to achieve it, but I was lazy, so I just played with those values until it looked kind of right. The margin right. So I heard someone mention the box model with the CSS. Margin is outside of your element, and padding is inside of your element. So what I do here on this .image class, I'm using margin, I'm saying I want everything outside of the image to be 1 rem to the right, which in this case will be 16 pixels to the right, no matter what. Float is something that changes how an element displays. So float left or float right tells the element, I want you to stop blocking the flow of the document, no matter what you are, and I want you to let everything flow past you. So what I do here is I have this set as float left, which is why the image here sets here, and then you can see everything off to the right. Now if I remove float left, what happens is my image just sets out there by itself because it is display block by default. So when I float it to the left, sort of an inline element and block element, float allows you to override default displays. So a lot of the times when you see text wrapping around something, it's been floated so the image can be in a nice spot. That's what the float does here. Text lead in, I made slightly larger. That's why it's just a little bit bigger than the base text. And I colored it black specifically. So something you can do in CSS, and I believe it was done some in the Code Academy. We worked through it. You don't have to always give hexadecimal values. You can give text values for something like 255 colors, I believe. If you just want to use the base, a large base set of colors. Downside to using the words is you're not guaranteed it will come out as the same color in every browser, except for black and white, because white is all zeros and black is all Fs, or that's inverted. I actually never remember. Okay, so all Fs is white, all zeros is no color. I actually always type it in, and then whichever one I get, I know that's black or white. Project link, which I'm applying on my anchor tags, gives a text decoration of none. So the default for anchor tags is that they'll have an underline in them. And a lot of times you don't really want the underline style that browsers give by default. So it's very common to do a text decoration none, moves that underline, and then font weight bold, because I sort of want it to stand out. And then the hover hand you get by default because it's an anchor tag. Same reason down here that this gets a little hover hand. And then I'm going to remove the HTML. So all I have for the HTML for this button, just as a reminder, before I cover the HTML for this, is I have a tag with a link that says contact me. But it's doing a lot more, as you can see, because of the CSS, getting a very different style than the other anchors on the page. This one is a whole button. So the way this works, and in the social media profile building, there was a button in that example, or maybe it was in the CSS. Showed a way to build a button. What I did here is I used the border radius, and you'll notice, so this is an example of where I'm using pixels instead of relative. Whenever you know that you want an element to always look the same, do not use relative sizing. Because we don't necessarily want that button to become super huge because someone changed the zoom level of their browser, or someone's using assistive technology and automatically makes their HTML be 24 pixels large, their font size. Because then what happens is your page gets really broken. And that's what I meant earlier by no matter how much you try, you just have a strong suggestion for what your page should display as. So here I set up the border radius. That's what gives it the little smooth edge there. The border, 2 pixels, solid, and the color. I use the same color as the link up above. This border, the pattern, whenever you specify it, will always be the size, style, and color. If you want, you can actually specify each one on its own, and you can type out border size or border width. That's what it is. Border width, I can say 2 pixels. Border style, and border color. And saying each one of those can actually be helpful if you're doing a specific state like I am below, where I only want to actually change one value, which is the style. So by default, I'm making the link 200 pixels wide. That's why it's always this size. And then I'm using margin 0 auto. What that does is it will center the text. It will center the element, so it is that anchor tag, inside of whatever container it is in. It will center it horizontally. So that's why the Contact Me button is always in the middle of the page, no matter the size of the page. Always stays in the middle. That's because I've set it to margin 0 auto, which says to give it vertical space of 0 and left to right space to automatically, and auto will give it equal size on both sides for the margin. And then the example, same thing that the book did, well, Code Academy, Twitter link. Change the display to block, so it changes the flow of it. Anchor tags by default are inline elements, so it would be display inline, and it would just stay in the same spot. But by making it a block, it makes it then break the flow of the document so that it gets its own special place. I changed the color, gave text decoration none. Now the pseudo selectors, this is an extra level of specificity on top of the class. So I have the class contact link, and then I'm using a pseudo selector of hover, which is the state that will happen. So this kind of gives a nice representation of what happens. Whatever element is applied to, it needs the class contact link, and then whenever you hover over it, you will get these styles applied to it. So in this case, all I actually needed to do here was border style, hashed. That's all I actually needed to override here, so that over here on hover, it goes in dashes. And that's another example of the cascading. The element itself has pixel set, has the border set to 2 pixels wide, and has a color. Both the color and the size still take effect even whenever I go and override just the style of the border. And then I go and change the color to black. And then I also change the background color. You can't tell on this projector, but I did make it change the background color ever so slightly so you can see it a little more. And then I use this, so that transition that occurs is because I'm using this, what's that called? Attribute. There we go. What you're wanting to transition with commas. Sort of showed this as a bonus. Throughout the examples that I'll use, I'm going to add in little extras that you can use or not use if you want to. Transition is a little bit more of an advanced option to use in your CSS, but it allows you to get nice user interactions and nice activity on the page without having to add any extra scripting to the page. And it generally is very fast for the computer to do it because it will use the computer's hardware and its graphics cards versus doing it all just in the software and memory. So that transition is why it changes from gray to black. As a note, not every element can be transitioned. Which means, so for example, I purposely did not put border in there because border is an attribute that won't transition. Not everything will do that nice transition automatically for you. So before I cover Git, are there any questions on the CSS or the HTML? All right, since all we did was cover branches, the Git, I will request questions from the audience. My plan here is to, by way of a shortcut command that I have, demonstrate what branches are in the history of a project. So feel free to post any Git-related questions you have. As I talk through this example, it may be sort of difficult to see. It's kind of as far as I can zoom and have it still be meaningful. You'll notice on the far left, there is a line that keeps going down. It breaks because the commit messages are shown. But this gives, each one of these lines is a branch. So we talked about branches. Each one of these lines is a branch. And as you work on a project over time, you'll have multiple branches. But what you usually end up doing is, as you'll see here, we have this green branch, this blue branch, and this purple branch. So at one point, someone was working and they said, all right, based on this blue branch, I'm going to create purple branch, do some work. And then I got done with my work. I put that and merged it. It's called merging. I used that branch and I went and put it in with the blue one. So now the blue and the purple come together and you end up with this yellow branch as it continues forward, which is just this same, each one of these lines is a branch over time. Each one of the little stars is a commit. So at the very end, so current, it's showing the current one. So I actually haven't touched this project in 9 months. But that top little asterisk is the latest commit, which is why it says head. So it had mentioned in that Git tower, head is what you're currently working on. What I'm currently working on is master. And what the, I don't know, orange colored text is how many other named branches are also right here. There's a branch called origin master. That's also right here. And there's a branch called origin head. That's right here. Because all of these commits are inside of a branch, they've all been merged out to that final one up there. So as you work on Git projects over time, you'll create multiple branches, you'll make changes, you'll go and submit likely some kind of peer review, pull request, code review to get people to look at your code. And then you'll go and merge that in with your main code base. So if you think about it as a tree, you sort of, this far left, you can view as like the trunk of the tree. And at one point, someone said, all right, I'm going to branch off this main tree. I'm going to go off this main trunk, create my branch, do some work. And much like real trees, you can have a branch that grows off of your existing branch. However, unlike real trees, what you end up normally doing is folding those branches back in over time because of the work that you've done. So on this little chart here, trunk is this far line on the left. And then as you can see in each one of these commits, some work was done to show there are older branches. So I do have old branches still on my computer because you don't actually have to delete branches. They can still remain forever sitting on your computer. Every branch you create will still just be sitting there unused unless you delete it. So I have not deleted these other branches. So I have another branch called origin GH pages, which it actually mentioned in the pre-work. You can use the GH pages branch on GitHub to sort of get like a free website hosting. Another one, origin fix release command. So in this specific project, in order to publish the code, I had broken how we published it. So you can see that I largely commit most of the changes, except there's a couple up there from someone else who created their own branch. As you can see here, made some changes, and then it eventually got merged back in. So in Git, all of your branches usually get merged back in. And you can see, so Git branch, these are all the branches that I have locally checked out, able to me to quickly do work on them. So I have a master branch, which is primarily what we've all been working on, and a branch called issue 6, Safari compatibility. I heard someone mentioning a lot of the times whenever you do work with branches, you'll generally name them after your ticket software. So in this case, I used GitHub as our ticketing software to track the work that I was doing. This was the 6th issue for this code base. So it's called issue 6, sort of the beginning, and then sort of the work that was being done, which was there's a Safari compatibility problem with the code. And then temp, because I was just doing some random work, and I called it a temp branch. Now, if you want to know what branches exist elsewhere, there's a git branch, and you can do -r. There's many things you can pass to git. Git branch -r says, what are all of my remote branches? So in this case, it's what are all the branches I have on GitHub? So I have a branch on GitHub called fix badge, fix release command, and a few other ones, which really means I'm bad at deleting branches. That's what that means, because most of those should be deleted. But they still exist out there, and you can see them on GitHub. So that's how you would check your branches locally. If you want to, so if you're doing work across a team, what you would normally see the GitHub UI, hopefully you're all familiar with it. You can come over here at this branch, and you can see all the branches that people have that they're currently working on that they've pushed out, that they've made available, that you could then pull down and check out, see what work they're doing. So in this case, this branch has update contributors. So someone had a branch where they did different work, and they updated August 18th of last year. Then you'll notice this other thing called tags. That's often used to indicate every release of a project. And then something else you can do is if you come over here, you can look at all the commits that have happened. So that git log command that you can run, you can look at all the commits on GitHub that have happened over time. And it gives you a nice way to be able to view messages that people have had with their commits. This also shows how you normally delete branches and have code changes come in. So for here, someone went and updated our license file, updated the contributors, and then I went and merged those in. There's a button on a pull request that you can do that will merge those changes in. An example of another project that has a bit more realistic commits of what would happen. Over time, I'll just do this one. So this is where I work. This is our main code base. We have 10,464 commits over the last couple years with about, on average, 8 people working on this code base. So over time, what you can see, so this is a good example of the ticketing system we use and what you would put in your commit messages. We have one person, Spencer, he's our release engineer. He merges everything in. Once he tests it and says it's good to go. That's why you'll see his face a lot, because he does the merge commits, which is why it has merge. But what you'll see in all of these is a ticket number in our commit messages. And what that does is it makes it really easy whenever, so for instance right here, you'll notice a little X kind of indicates that something was broken. So you can go over here, you can click on GitHub, it'll show you the changes the person made. So in this case, they changed their CSS, changed the color to not have that bang warning, or yeah, I usually refer to it as a bang. It can also be referred to as an exclamation point, and just changes the color to be a color warning color. The main point being here, oftentimes in your commit messages, you'll tie them to tickets. So then later, as you look through people's commit messages, instead of necessarily having to look at all the code that changed, you can open your ticketing software, see what changes they made. And we also create branches based on those. So every one of those is their own branch. So over here in the UI, we have branches. You can go into the branch and you can see all the commits that are made which those tests didn't pass either. But then you can go in each branch, see the work that's been done in each branch. So GitHub gives you another way to explore Git branches and can hopefully help explain that better conceptually. I've not seen any questions on Git yet. So that means we're going to move on to the studio unless there's a question.
Gary?
Yep.
Tonight's prep work talked about the git stash function, and I'm not clear on when or how or why you would use git stash. I get really confused trying to keep straight all of those different branches. You know, each one is its own little variation on a theme and how you pull them all back together again. And git stash, we talk about being able to temporarily store some work, but I don't know how you then reincorporate that back into anything later.
Yes, so something I might do here is actually, so due to some plugins I have, it shows a little X here whenever I'm in a Git repo and there's been changes, but I ran git status. This says that I've modified 2 files. They're unstaged, which means those changes are not going to happen if I go to a different branch. They're not going to be on my master branch. So what I might do here, in order, if I say I wanted to create a new branch here, so this was mentioned in another group, you can do -b whenever you do git checkout. What that will do is check out and change your branch. So we'll do the git checkout and the branch switch all in one command. So what I might do here is changes in class. So I'll create a branch called changes in class. Then I come over here. I still haven't committed any of these changes. So if I run git status, we'll have those uncommitted changes floating around unstaged. But as you can see, I'm in a new branch called changes in class.
Okay, great. You made changes to those 2 files on your computer. Which branch do they live in right now?
They don't live in any branch.
Where do they live?
They are in no branches. So that is what not staged in Git means. When you run git status and it says it's not staged, those changes are not in any branches. They are just in your file system. The branch does not have that change. Until you commit them, until you do a git add, you do not have any of those changes. So here, I do a git add, and then I run a git status. That period is saying add everything to the index that you're currently at. So I do git status, and now this says changes to be committed. So those 2 changes will be here. So now if I try to do a git checkout master, we notice those changes are still not on a branch. They're added to the index. What that means is your head. So in Git, this is sort of some details most of the time you won't ever worry about, and I never actually worry about this. Head is what you're always currently doing. So those changes right now are all in the head state. Head is just a reference of what you're currently looking at. So until you commit it, it's never in a branch. It's always just in that ephemeral head state. So here, head is pointing to master, but since I've not committed it, those changes are not in the master branch.
Is the head a reference to your local computer?
More or less, yes. Head, you can think of head as just sort of a reference to your current file structure. Pretend Git's not there at all. Head is just kind of your file structure. That was a lot. We should not have ran that. I'll just do that. So what you can see here, the head just kind of points to all the different folders I have and the files underneath them. So what I wanted to show here, the difference between those branches, is that right now, none of this is on a branch. Now, if you had conflicts between branches, when I try to do something like git checkout changes in class, it will actually throw an error and say there are conflicts, cannot change branches. So what I would normally do here, ran that last command to unstage things. Don't worry about that last one. What I would do here, if I were in the middle of a bunch of work right now, but it's not quite enough that I want to commit it, because I don't necessarily want to make that message, what I would run here is a git stash. You'll notice it gave this message, save working directory and index state, work in progress on change in class, add some possible answers, head is now at the previous commit. So git stash, as you can see, in the command line here, I stopped having an X. So if I run git status now, there's nothing to be done. Now I can come over here, and I can do git checkout master, I can keep doing work, I can go and create a new branch off of master.
So in other words, you're saying you can't change what branch you're wanting to work on unless you have committed all the changes that you're currently working on in that branch.
Say that again?
So if I'm working in branch A, and I've got a bunch of files that I haven't staged or committed yet, and I decide I want to go work on another branch, I can't just go make checkout, git checkout, new branch, whatever that new branch happens to be, and it will automatically move to it because it doesn't know what to do with whatever I was doing on branch A. It can't move to branch B until it knows what I want to do with branch A.
Kind of. So the question is, whenever I am doing work on a given branch, so in this case, say I'm doing work on the changes in class branch. So I go and I make a bunch of changes. I've done work, and someone calls and says, user tried to log in and everything's broken, and you need to go update the login form on the website, which would take precedence over your current work of making a new style button. So the user can't log in, you need to immediately go and change the work you're doing. It's usually one of the most common cases for needing to switch branches in the middle of your work. You know the work you've done so far isn't really committable. It's not quite done. You may be in the midst of changing a file and your code's actually just completely broken. So you don't want to leave your branch in an unworking state. So that's usually where you would use git stash, because at that point, if you attempt to do a git checkout master and you have a lot of changes to your files and you haven't checked out master in a long time, and master has a bunch of updates that your code does not, when you attempt to switch branches, what will often happen is there will be what are called conflicts in the files. So when you start working across a team, you'll run into conflicts. Oftentimes, as you switch between shared branches, like master, and when you attempt to do that git checkout master, you'll get an error message, and you won't be able to go and change that code. So what you'll do then is the git stash command that I had ran, and then that will stash the work that you've done in a temporary branch. And you can see all the stashes that you've created by running git stash list, so we can see that one stash that I've made so far, which is stash at, give a little bracket 0, because I didn't give the stash a name when I made it. So it will by default just keep giving it an incremented name there. And it gives it sort of a made up message there as well by default. So let's say I went and I was out on my master branch. I do some work, I commit it, and I fixed the login form. I want to go back to the work that I was doing. So now I want to go back to my changes in class. That is where, so sort of give an example of the things you can do with Git. So every command in Git, you can do a --help afterwards. Get a nice little readout about what it does. Git stash will list out what is available there. So the command I ran before was git stash pop, which what git stash pop does is it takes your current work and puts it in that temporary location. So that's what git stash list shows that. If I want to get that work, I can run git stash pop, and it will reapply those changes that I was working on before. Pop will always do the last stash that you made. So now if I do git stash list, I have no stashes because I popped it. Get one list of one stash that I had.
Last stash being the most recent.
Yes. So pop will always get the most recent stash that you've created. And stashes are always just local to your computer. So keep that in mind if you're using a stash when you go work on a different laptop. You're not going to have those stashes anymore because they're not shared. It's only on your computer. It's another reason that you might do that is because if you're working with someone on a branch, you guys are pushing up changes, that's one of the reasons you may not commit directly to that branch. That's why it's another reason you may use stash. Have a temporary, to temporarily hold your work. So I can do that again. I can run git stash, and then that temporarily holds the work. And then later on, I can come back, git stash pop. Run git stash pop later, puts those changes back on, and you can see then what's going to change later. Then I can add these to my branch. Except I want to actually add them to the master branch. And then as you'll see when you submit your assignment, you'll need to run that git push, and that will push your code out to wherever it's going. I run clear a lot so that the work that I've done is at the top of the screen, so it can be easier to see. That's just a terminal command that clears the text on the screen. So I added, committed, gave the message, tells me what changed, and then I went and pushed those changes to GitHub. That is what the git push command that I ran here did afterwards. So whenever you go to make your changes that you're submitting for class, you'll do git push to your remote repository on GitHub for each one of the assignments you work on. So the assignment for next Thursday, you'll run that command when you're really various stages while you're working on the code, but when you're definitely done, you'll run that to push out your changes so that launch code can see all of the work that you're doing. Are there any other questions? And sort of to reiterate, stashes are only local on your computer, so you cannot push them directly.
It says in the message, 4 branches, 1 get ahead, or one commit ahead of, 1 commit behind, whatever's on the cloud. What is that? How do you bring that up to speed?
So the question is, whenever you end up with messages that tell you your branch is 1 ahead or 1 behind whatever the remote branch is, so it might say you're 1 ahead of what's on GitHub or you're 1 behind what's on GitHub. So if it says you're behind, you usually run git pull. That will update you. I'm already up to date, which is what it says. What I just did was git push in order to push those changes up, which is why it said I was one ahead a second ago. Then I git pushed it. Now we're at the same state. Both GitHub and my repository have the same commits.
So it doesn't matter if you're like 5 commits behind and you do a git pull, does that pull everything within those 5 commits all at the same time, or do you have to pull it 5 times?
So the question is, if I'm working on this master branch and GitHub has another 5, 10, 100 commits that I do not have, and I run a git pull command, will it pull in every change? Yes. Git pull will pull in every change from the last time that you updated your code. So git pull will say, all right, you have, so for instance, if I were here, and this was the last bit of code that I had, and I ran git pull, and those other 3 commits above it were all on GitHub. When I run git pull, I'll automatically get all 3 of those commits. I'll get the commits that were 25 hours ago, and then the one from 3 minutes ago as well. So actually, if Jonathan still has the repo on his computer, he can demonstrate if he runs git pull, because he's added changes. So we could show everyone. Wants to look at. Oh, you don't have it on that laptop? Well, you might be able to see it. You might just be editing it in GitHub's UI, which you can do, and just cheat it. But that's what happens if you run, if you say this is your latest that you have, you run git pull, you get all the commits that have happened since the last time you did a git pull. There we go. Alrighty, we will go on to the studio. For tonight, if you can pull it up locally, apparently it's just going to be really slow for me. Studio for this evening is to try out the Chrome debugger, or web inspector, as it is also called, and go to a news site and sort of play with the news site. So I sort of showed this with the code that I was running locally. So we can go to New York Times. That's not oh good. That's why you should always search for websites, not just type them in. So here, I could, if I would want to for fun, come over here, use the web inspector. So if you right click on it, you'll see inspect. I believe Internet Explorer and Firefox have the same behavior. If you're using Safari, there are not developer tools by default. So I do not recommend using Safari as your development web browser. You can if you download a plugin that Apple has produced to have a similar feature set in Safari, depending on your Mac. So here what you can do is I can come in here and I can change this, I can go and make that, and then I can say handling of case. So you can go and you can change it sort of any title that you want as the web inspector. You can go in here. If I also wanted, so this is the story heading, has an anchor tag. If I double click here, I can then just change it to be a paragraph tag, and that actually completely breaks it. So it's no longer an anchor tag. That sort of web inspector gives you a lot of freedom to change things. So over here, what I can do is on this specific element, I think I can. There we go. I can zoom in on the bottom. So if I'm over here, it highlights, so you can see down here in the element inspector, I'm on this title tag that links to a New York Times FBI inspection. I change the text, and this sort of shows where you're at. Over here, and this is what I was opening up before, I can go and say, all right, I want the font family here. Wingdings. If you're on a Windows computer, you can change it to Wingdings, and it's a lot more fun. We'll go with cursive. Something else that's kind of nice, if you're on Chrome, if you start to type out a font family, what is it? There we go. Change the font family of the element. I could also make the font size be 200 pixels, make it really big. Make it 10 pixels, make it really small. One to be really obnoxious. I could break the page. A better example here. So I can inspect at the New York Times at the top here. Now as I scroll through this page, I have the New York Times hanging out as I scroll down the page because I went and added this CSS attribute called position.
You're changing this for everyone in the world, right?
No. So that's a good point. All the changes you make here down here in the Chrome inspector are just for you to see. Nobody else can see them because they're just on your local computer. So if I come over here, I change the Z index to be really big. That's just so it stays above the images. So as you scroll down, you can sort of change stuff as you go along. Something I have actually done for this class better example in previous assignments. So if you'll notice, I don't have to scroll. Anytime you see me want to open one of these up, I never have to scroll. And it's because I've actually using a browser plugin called StyleBot that, based on the website that I'm on, allows me to change the styles. So if I come down here and I do edit CSS, you can see that I have set the height of this box to auto, which is what makes it always be big. Otherwise, if I come in here, yeah, there we go. So I've set it to auto. When I remove that, so the default style that is created by launch code for that element is to give it a height of 200 pixels. That's why no matter what content is in there, you get a scroll bar. You have to scroll for a very long time, depending on the amount of content that's in there. So what I did was I used this Chrome plugin called StyleBot. There's a similar one for Firefox. I played around in here until I found the style that I needed to overwrite. So you can actually see that here. I end up having to scroll inside of this box in order to get to the bottom. But when I go and apply that style, that box no longer scrolls. So that's somewhere where if you're on a website, you find something about it annoying, you can just change it. And if you use a plugin like StyleBot, it will be there every time you go back to the website so that you don't have to mess with it all the time. That is all from playing around with the inspector. The other thing with the elements is, so notice the difference between where's my view? So in your view, another way to get to it other than right-clicking is you can go to View. On Windows, it may say Preferences or Help. Don't remember, it might say View. There's usually a spot that says Developer, and then Developer Tools will open these developer tools or close them if they're already closed. So if I click it, it opens the developer tools like I had them a second ago. Another thing you can do, so the last thing before we go and break off and have fun, there's actually a channel in Slack to post, as an example, some of the stuff that you mess with as you mess with the different websites locally. This one is to view the HTML of the web page, which is why I went and clicked the view, the developer, and the view source. This is a good way if you want to see the HTML that a website is serving. If you notice here on the New York Times, our head examples really only had title and one of these meta tags and maybe one link. Actual websites often will have tens to hundreds of items in the head tag. Lots and lots and lots inside that head tag. So an example, it's a little smaller, my personal website. So it gives the character set, the title. You have an option, you can host CSS remotely, or you can put it in your head. So I have a head tag here that has all the CSS, and then the body has all the content of the website in it. And that's what you can do if you ever want to view the source of a website in Chrome. You just go to the website, view, and you can see the source. Be a good way to figure out different ideas for laying out, if you're trying to figure out how a website did a certain style. But break out into your groups and try these out. That's actually all I have for the rest of the evening. So work on that with your groups, and if you still have time, try to get ahead on the assignment for Thursday next week, as well as the reading. Oh.
Is everyone able to get the developer tools on their browsers and show up?
Do you remember? Teaching fellows, make sure that your students are pairing off to sort of work on all studios. So they're getting some work with other people. So try to make sure your groups are pairing, trying stuff out, learning from each other. We could do that in any fashion you want.
For anybody who missed it, studios are going to be done together too. So.
Oh, that's right. Yeah. And I think that yeah. Right. Which I used to do. Yeah. I think everybody. It's all manual. And that's sort of, I mean, that's the way I've seen people learn mess things up, and this is more kind of our that's the thing. Yes, that's where. Yeah. Well. I actually
Every time I touch it,
like I'll just start and I'll be like 4 hours. Yeah. So I know what I'm like.
Plus.
That's what I'm saying. Oh, yeah. Yeah.
It's like,
So the thing is, they collapse.
oh yeah.
So that's where.
Yeah.
Is everybody agreeing to make changes to the site?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Right, exactly.
So, yeah, writing some code, there's 20,000 people.
Yeah, so then you did some of the same, so.
It's not that effective. There's some other stuff, right? So like if you go to font size.
Yeah, that's actually for this class.
So they're in the thing.
Yeah, all the way. Jack will shoot.
Oh, what?
Yeah, pretty excellent.
But oh yeah.
really small. Yeah.
I'm trying to get them not
Oh, yeah. But however, really sad.
Gary, are we gonna be here Monday?
No, we will not be here Monday.
Did you announce that?
I did.
Right, I asked my group and they didn't know. So.
It's also on the calendar. Yes.
Are we meeting?
We were, I went over part of the part of the safety person to be here tonight, and partly because I came off the
I mean, they definitely did notice. Yeah. Well, it was the questions. Private conversation. Oh, yeah. I did that last time.
But I had. Like on purpose?
You know it's too long.
I don't know about the dress breakers, but I don't know what comes back in. But I don't know. It was literally about the. I'm trying to like shout. Since then.
Yeah.
I'm like, I feel like this.
I couldn't tell.
I mean, I did have my group, so when we had tables that were across from each other, it was fun.
I have seen your center.
Artists, and so a bunch of them just moved behind the other tables, so now I'm here.
So.
Oh, like
Attempted to get people
stretch.
not just stretching, just like.
Do what?
Growing areas just kind of
Yeah.
stop.
Yeah, I don't understand.
Around 7:30.
So much of the 7 stretch.
Get them?
Well, no, have like a.
Oh, I see.
Oh, so you're like just do a slow walk and talking, staring at people.
I don't feel like
Slowly.
I like to not
Can you repeat that again?
feels like they're last week, 75% of them left.
We don't have one. I don't know that I have time.
Complex, but now he's gonna. Well, he has it on plus.
So usually
Outside of class. So I like to.
Yes, I have.
not expert, but like, like majority of my days in line. SSH server that identifies. One thing I realized is get commands are your problem. They're super simple. Commands.
I was sitting there and Stop. Yeah, that needs to be a thing. Shut that down. And just everyone
So Gary uses.
Sorry. I was just sitting there.
About the presentation or anything.
I will walk about 25 minutes.
Not about like sending you, just to if it's like that person.
It was too cold. I did not expect to get and I should walk on people seem
Do you think for microfinance,
I'm trying to run to
Because all I do
so I failed to put this
Well, yeah, I saw that you had the link like on the.
oh, that one is wrong. That link's from first.
But I guess I didn't realize that you posted that.
I posted it in the class.
Was it always the same? Or you made
No, it's a different video. Actually, each class will be later. I didn't. I feel like number 3. I saw my
And those still work.
Yeah. That's why part of this is review. Part of this is
like, oh, there's actually a
Bye. Thanks. Okay, so where are we going? Is the home KC or do I?
for the video. The in-class video is I always post an KC January link to it, but while I remember to I posted it inside the response.
So the webinar.
Yeah.
They're charging training. The webinar is less. Basically, salary is they're extra material for the students to be able to have different learning. A lot of them are kind of like tangible information software.
So just kind of like
Extra tidbit, yes. Science. And if anyone wants to cover other that I think more tactical things you find interesting, you can feel free once I actually stop going over on time. That had that like starting at like 8:15. From that point.
Like unit 3 would be a good time to like bring in frameworks.
Yeah.
I think unit 2 is going to bring the
We'll just bring in bootstrap.
I told them all about Bootstrap.
when somebody was asking questions for websites, I think you should wait till bootstrap, but let's just dumb it down for this assignment.
I kind of did the same thing, except for like, I was like, they started asking a bunch of questions. I'm like, let's just wait until we start like the linked list.
I told them to download Bootstrap, and then they downloaded it, but then they started changing CSS in Bootstrap. And I was like, that's not what I'm supposed to do. So how do you make them like see in Bootstrap at the top? Yeah, I showed them. And then when I told them to download it, for me, that just means like import the script tag. But yeah, you gotta be more specific.
I don't know the schedules for next time, but I foresee lots of issues with the assignment. So if there is extra.
Yes, well, that's the other reason for there's supposed to be about 45 minutes of the class stream. Just to be able to cover that.
I told them all, like last class, that they should be starting. I foresee those issues.
If they just copy the code they have, that's like 75% of the assignment.
I think that's a real block.
A lot of that stuff is
Literally
like,
write each step.
And I'm lazy, I really should also do the generate stuff.
I did look at that assignment and it literally tells them, put this in, put this in, put this in.
Oh, someone in your group kind of wanted me to grade it. I'm like, I haven't seen Phil.
It's hard right now.
Yeah.
Town.
Close it up. Close it up. Don't have to go home.
That's how Semisonic song ends.